Two names destined to be inextricably bound to the BBC brand. Now on BBC4, Greg Dyke on Lord Reath.
The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures.
The BBC is unique and powerful. Some would say too powerful.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Here is the news read by Derek Baker. Britain is to test a new guidance.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
The BBC was created in 1922 by this man, John Reith. They say in his own image. But what was that image? How much did the character of this man dictate the structure and objectives of the BBC I ran for 4 years? In short, who was John Reith? Luckily, we've discovered fragments of the Reith family life filmed by his wife. And even luckier, Reith kept a daily diary which reveals the private man behind the public face.
His background was in the Free Church of Scotland. Much of the BBC structure was based on the Church of Scotland.
The BBC became John's church, his pulpit, and he knew how to mesmerise people. He was a prodigious actor, but he could only play one part, that of John Reath.
He was big, he was craggy, he was aggressive, he was insecure, he was amusing, he was frightening.
He was certainly a depressive. He could have terrible rages, but I learned that the best way was to stand up to him and not to be cowed by him.
He was a very arrogant man. He was 36, and he was offered a knighthood, and he snorted and said, "This is ridiculous. It's not nearly enough."
Reith made broadcasting in Britain. He was controversial, however. He never had everybody on his side. He didn't want them to be on his side, necessarily. He wanted to lead.
Most people looking at their life would look back at something like the BBC and this enormous worldwide respect and say, that would do me.
Oh yes. Most normal people and a great many not at all normal people would think that. But John Reith was John Reith.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House.
It's not given to many people that their name becomes part of the language, as a trait, a characteristic or a standard. But that is exactly what happened to John Charles Walsham Reith. In the Oxford Dictionary, it says, Reithian, of, pertaining to, or characteristic of Reith or his principles, especially relating to the responsibility of broadcasting to enlighten and educate public taste. Reith created a BBC that promised to educate, inform and entertain, in that order. It will be an independent voice. It will be sustained by a licence fee set by the government. And it's this relationship between the government and the BBC's independence that I'm also going to explore. Apart from Reith, I think I was the only Director General to be appointed, never having worked for the BBC. So my preconceptions of the BBC were those of an outsider. And what I found was that there was something stifling about Lord Reith's influence over the whole organisation. My view was that while the BBC should respect its past, even celebrate it, it was important that it didn't live in the past. And yet there was always a danger that because of the strength of the Reith legacy, that was exactly what it was going to do.
Hi, how are you? Robert, what do you want, guys?
Greg Dyke's first day at the BBC. Jokey, informal, never a conventional Director General. That's why, when I first saw the panelled walls of the BBC Council Chamber covered with portraits of past Director Generals, I thought it gave precisely the wrong message. Now, the portraits have been moved to the BBC in West London. All of them, that is, except Reith's. John Reith's ashes lie buried in a tiny churchyard in the shadow of the Cairngorm Mountains in his native Scotland. By the time he died in 1971, thousands of people worked for the BBC around the world, and his reputation as a leader, firm but fair, was secure. His was a black and white morality. It was from his parents, his father in particular, that Reith
learned his attitude to life. He came from stern, austere Presbyterian stock. His father was for 53 years the minister at the United Free Church in Glasgow's University District. And it was what he heard from the pulpit and learned from daily prayers with his parents that drove Reith to use, as A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, later described, the brute force of the BBC monopoly to stamp Christian morality on the British people, a dictatorship of broadcasting. In effect, Reith's BBC was a personal crusade based on his form of Christianity.
People working particularly on the programme believed profoundly in the influence of broadcasting. They came there because they believed profoundly and felt a sort of a call to it.
John Reith's daughter, Marista, now lives 50 miles from where his ashes lie buried. She's written a book about her father, and it's a pretty critical assessment of him. It was she who guided me through the family history. The seventh child, and much younger than his two sisters and four brothers, young John was apparently an accident.
He was 10 years younger than his next brother. So with parents who were desperately diligent in their parish, there was very little attention and very little affection that was available to this guy. He was a loner.
Unlike his older brothers, young John Reith was in trouble at school. He was eventually transferred from the Glasgow Academy to an English boarding school in East Anglia.
He was asked to leave school?
Yes.
What happened?
Slightly hushed up.
What was it about?
Unruly behaviour, wild temper, poor academic results. I think it was not a great mixture.
Was he bullied or was he bullying?
I suppose it's not unfair to say that he was a bully right the way through his life.
When he was at home in the holidays, he spent many hours alone in the nearby Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow. But John Reith, even in his teens, felt he was a man with a mission, as yet unspecified. He would come here to sniff the winds that blew from the Campsie Hills. For the young Reith, they carried messianic messages. Messages that, according to his diaries, he believed would give a clue to his destiny. In short, he came here to listen to God.
He seemed to grow up with this great conviction that he was different, that something enormous was expected of him. I must say, I wonder if one can't trace it back to his understandable desire that somehow or other he'd got to escape out of the family nexus, which was malignant. Affection. That's what that family lacked. And all through his life, John was looking for somebody to love him.
Who's to say where an inner drive to succeed comes from?
I suspect, it goes back to his own relationship with his own parents, and this was a lonely kid, but incredibly determined and with this belief that he was going to achieve great things.
And in a way, he simply seems to be saying to his parents, look, notice me, I'm worth something. It's no surprise then to discover that Reith sought affection elsewhere. He found it almost next door, in the boy next door. He was a fair-haired 17-year-old named Charlie Bowser. Reith was 24.
Charlie was a younger man with whom there was a very intense friendship. John lavished on him a warmth of affection of the kind which he felt he had not quite received himself. He would, as it were, look after this younger man, who returned the affection enormously. And they meant a great deal to one another.
Just how much emerges from what's left of Reith's daily diary. In September 1912, Reith wrote of Charlie, very good-looking and awfully pretty eyes. And by 1913, they were sometimes sharing the same bed. Ian McIntyre, formerly controller of BBC Radio's 3 and 4 and a biographer of Reith's, has explored those diaries.
He poured himself into those diaries daily. A more normal person would have spoken to his wife or had a drink with a friend and got rid of frustrations in that way. But Reith, he wrote it all down. And this was obsessional. Not just the writing of the diary, but the collection of things related to the diary. Letters, invitations, train tickets.
Do you think the diaries were a true reflection of Reith?
Oh yes, they were an essential reflection of Reith. But there are whole slabs of them which he doctored, and we will never know, we cannot know what the original version said.
To John Reith, any consummation of his love for Charlie would have been a sin. In addition, for much of the 20th century, homosexuality in the UK was illegal. Lord Asa Briggs also had access to Reith's diaries. He felt Reith had been desperate to discuss his private life.
Reith would deliberately leave out bits of the diary which he thought would interest me. There were elements in the diaries which I read, which I wouldn't have dreamed about of talking to anybody, least of all to Reith, who I think would probably like to have talked to me about them.
So you knew about Charlie Bowser?
I knew all about that, and it didn't affect anything that I said of him as, first of all, general manager, then managing director.
Reith's was the generation that spanned and suffered 2 world wars. In 1914, Reith was in the Territorial Army and was almost immediately sent to the Western Front with the Scottish Rifles. Reith confided to his diary that he and Charlie prayed together on the way to the railway station. Charlie put on Reith's gold ring and kissed it. Reith recorded that he had kissed him before the troop train left for France.
Do you think Charlie Bowser was the love of his life?
Yes, I do. Yes, I think he was. Because of the destruction of these crucial sections of the diaries and the destruction of all the letters that passed between them, we can never know the whole truth. But enough remains.
So you think it was a homosexual relationship?
Yes, I've come to think it was.
It's not just that we're seeing it from today's society, and that it was possible then to have pals almost, and nothing more.
Well, pals, yes. First of all, I think one has to consider why he wanted to destroy those early sections of the diary. Why there was this constant expression of feelings of sin in the diaries. But also in what remains of the diaries, the accounts of the times they spent together, the swimming naked in the pools, the sharing of a bed, the warm embrace at Victoria Station when he was going away to the front and so on. I think there is enough there still.
Throughout the war, John Reith carried 2 photographs in his wallet. One was of his father. The other was of Charlie.
Reith was a remarkable soldier. He was brave almost to the point of being reckless. He would quite regularly come out of the trenches and walk along the top in full view of the Germans over there. And of course he did it to make a point to those less brave or less foolhardy than himself. He says in his diaries that he never had a problem and he was never scared walking in open ground.
What was unique about Reith was a sense of invincibility and the feeling that although people were dying in their thousands, he would be bound somehow or other to be saved.
Why?
Well, I think he believed that God was with him, and I think he also believed that there are jobs that should be done and are waiting to be done.
But Reith's luck couldn't last. On October the 7th, 1915, a year after he'd come to Flanders, he was hit in the head, and half his face was shot away. Remarkably, he stayed conscious throughout, and actually was complaining bitterly about blood, his blood, going all over his best uniform, which he happened to be wearing that day. But as he lay, he asked for a scrap of paper so he could write to his mother, and on it he just wrote, "I'm all right."
Still writing every day to Charlie, Reith was shipped back to England to recuperate. He was later to receive psychiatric treatment. Then he met Muriel Odhams, the upper-class daughter of a leading British publisher.
Muriel came from a totally different background from him. They were not the kind of family with whom the Reiths would have had much dealings. I think he was in love with Muriel, and I think she was marvellous with him in a way. She tried her best to give him solace and comfort.
But according to Reith's diaries, Charlie was still very much in his mind.
He spoke frequently of making a new life for Charlie and himself in America after the war. There were almost 3 people in that courtship. On the day he proposed to her, they were out in the open, and he and Charlie prayed together. It was a most extraordinary sequence.
There's also some suggestion, of course, that Charlie liked Muriel.
Yes, I think he did, and was really quite upset when Reith did finally become engaged to her. Crept into bed beside him and had to be comforted. But it was Reith who decided that now that he was married, Charlie, he'd better tidy things up, and Charlie better be married too.
So Reith introduced Charlie to a girl called Maisie. It was 1921, the year before Reith was to join the BBC.
Charlie was gradually drawn into that relationship, and Reith, having set it up in the first place, became jealous. Jealous that Charlie was going to be taken away from him, although he himself, by this time, was already married, of course.
It is strange, isn't it, that whatever relationship it was with Charlie, it was over when he was comparatively young.
Yes.
And yet it dominated the next 50 years.
Yes. Charlie's birthday was at the end of December. Every year, without fail, if you read Reith's diaries, you see him going into a trough of depression at that time of year.
Reith had trained as a locomotive engineer, and he joined the BBC almost by accident.
With his engineering background, it was more likely that he'd end up running something like a railway company. One thing was certain was that from the very beginning, he was never going to be an engine driver, because he always believed he was destined for greatness. But he also believed that he was here to do God's work, so he was prepared to wait the call.
Before he went to the BBC, he went to the Presbyterian Church in London. And the minister said, perhaps in this church tonight there is somebody who is called to do a great thing. And Reith said, that's me, that's me. And shortly afterwards he went home and he read the advertisement for the British Broadcasting Company in formation, seeks a general manager. Only those with extensive experience need apply. Well, Reith had no experience in broadcasting. Reith didn't know what broadcasting was. But then nobody did. Nobody did.
He then realised that there were certain advantages in the fact that the chairman of the committee who would interview him was an Aberdonian. And he did one of the most daring things of his life, which is in his own club in London, he managed to get the letter of application which he'd sent, to get it out of the box where it had been put, and to change it and make more references to his own Aberdonian ancestry.
In fact, Reith probably wasn't first choice for the job. It's said a Sunday Express journalist, John Gordon, was offered it and turned it down because it wasn't as good a job as being a Fleet Street columnist.
Reith certainly felt, when he got the job as general manager of the BBC, the Almighty was at work, and expressed it so in his own diary.
Creating the BBC could simply have been a huge technical exercise, but in Reith's hands, it became a moral crusade.
The object of the exercise originally was to sell radio sets. How do you sell wireless sets? By providing entertaining material. But very early on, while it was still a company, it's quite plain that Reith's mind was moving in a very different direction. He wrote a book in 1924, Broadcast Over Britain. And read that book today and you see the bare bones of it all there. He was already, in effect, running this commercial company like a public service organisation.
Hello, Marconi House, London, calling.
The national network of transmitters, the talks and the news bulletins, the symphony and dance orchestras, the thoughts for the day, all made up the context in which he would pass on to millions the lessons and values he had learned at his father's knee at the manse in Glasgow.
It might seem a slightly odd thing to say now, but much of the BBC structure was based on the Church of Scotland, because you had the Director General playing the role of the minister, you had the church elders, who would be the governors, and then you would have the congregation as the audience.
The BBC was paid for partly by the sale of wireless sets, and partly by a licence fee, with listeners charged 10 shillings a year, nearly £20 in today's money.
He was never convinced by the licence fee, particularly at the beginning. He seriously considered what would happen when the licence fee failed, as he thought it might do, and he was faced with looking for alternative sources of income, and the obvious one was advertising or perhaps a subscription service. He was sometimes stereotyped as being anti-anything which might be light-hearted or entertainment-driven, but after all, he recognised the need for universal appeal, although I still think that he would be astonished that in today's market-driven broadcasting market, that the licence fee had stood the test of time.
In 1922, only 80,000 households had radios. 2 years later, it was more than 1 million. Radio became the prime method of reaching the people in Britain and later around the world. The BBC was a private company, and Reath ran it like a personal fiefdom.
Reith was the figure who really mattered in broadcasting, and it was a Reithian BBC.
Whichever way you look at it, Reith's achievement was massive. Starting in 1922 with a blank sheet of paper, he created a cultural organisation, which is one of Britain's great contributions to the world.
Despite all this, John Reith was not a happy man.
There was an element of gloom and doom in his personality, almost apocalyptic at times.
Recognition, rank, status meant a great deal to him.
He sometimes felt that he was failing when other people would have said he was doing a perfectly good job.
I think he was in some ways an insecure man, because this business of never having gone to university stayed with him.
He certainly did expect a bit too much of himself. On the other hand, it is that sense of expecting more than he could necessarily offer which makes him, to my mind, a really great man.
Great men are often very different at home. The obsessive energy and moral rectitude that made Reith so revered at work wouldn't necessarily generate a loving atmosphere at home. Reith and Muriel had 2 children, Christopher, born in 1928, and Marista, 4 years later. Marista was educated at home at Harrius House in Buckinghamshire until she was 14.
I suppose there was a kind of enclosure sense about this place, because my mother felt that if a child had a big garden and lots of toys, nothing much else was needed. I had bicycles and teddies and all the rest of it, and a pond in which to sail my boats. I also thought, I wonder what happens in the big wide world.
And how much was your father here?
That's hard to say, because, you see, we lived very separate lives. One end of the house was the nursery, and that was very different from the other end of the house, which is just behind me, which was, so to speak, the public part. I was, to a large extent, rather unaware of his comings and goings. I mean, his own visits to the nursery would be very occasional, and they were sort of ambassadorial in nature. Although he hadn't grown up in this kind of elaborate lifestyle, he seemed to feel that he needed servants and guests and all the rest of it.
Marista remembers her father summoning her to the other end of the house to play before his guests.
The demand to play in front of people, age 6. Can you think of anything more devastating?
Why did he do that?
Because I would lend an extra distinction to him. Nothing to do with me.
Did your father play with you a lot?
As though every now and then he felt that he had to. And we wished that he didn't feel that, because he didn't have play in him, really. I mean, yes, if my mother got her silly camera, he would make it look as though this is how things happened. But it was very formal, and it was sometimes rather painful. Deep snow one day, and set about having a snowball fight. And as he was very tall and extraordinarily strong, when the snowballs hit their target, it was incredibly painful. Ouch. And I felt intimidated and extraordinarily annoyed about this, because mine were such sort of spongy affairs by comparison. How can I retaliate against this man who doesn't really know how to play in a relaxed way so that everybody's having a good time?
When you played games with him, he liked to win?
I think he had to win, yes.
His son Christopher showed an early interest in forestry. It became his career, far removed from Reith's ambitions for him.
You weren't allowed to be mediocre. You had to be special. Especially for the boy. John was intimidating in the extreme. John said to the nurse, "Be careful of that baby that you're holding. Remember, you have a future Archbishop of Canterbury or Prime Minister in your arms."
All the way through this interview, you call him John. Did you never call him Dad?
No, but he wasn't Dad in anybody's reckoning. I regard him as John very much more than my father. Certainly not as Daddy.
Well, it's interesting coming here to Reith's house because what you discover is this immensely powerful, influential man who was a real leader in one part of his life, was a complete disaster in the other, and that his domestic life was chaotic. Brought up 2 kids, but as his daughter has told us, he was a remote figure. He wasn't part of their lives at all. And yet his staff, in the other half of his life, thought he was a wonderful man and a wonderful leader. So you get this real contradiction.
I'm pretty glad that Reith wasn't my father.
By 1926, 4 years after it was born, Reith had made the BBC a power in the land.
The number of licences had increased dramatically, and with it, the BBC's income. But the amount of news that the BBC was allowed to broadcast was still limited. And then, one Friday evening in late April, the dance music being played by Jack Payne and his orchestra was interrupted with a message from the Prime Minister, which, characteristically, Reith decided to introduce himself.
This is London calling the British Isles. The crisis. All efforts at compromise between the Trade Union Council and the government regarding the position in the coalfields have failed.
Britain was now in the grip of its first and only general strike.
In the absence of newspapers, further news bulletins will be broadcast at frequent intervals.
The strike was to become the first supreme test of the BBC's independence. The government printed a newspaper called the British Gazette, and Winston Churchill was in charge of it. But Churchill also wanted to take over the BBC. Reith would have none of it. He vetted every news bulletin himself.
The Board of Trade have therefore made today, Tuesday, an order under the Emergency Powers Act.
Reith broadcast statements from the unions, which annoyed Churchill. On the other hand, he listened to Tory Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and stopped the Archbishop of Canterbury broadcasting a plea for peace.
Reith's record in the general strike is probably impeccable.
It did good things for the BBC and bad things for Reith in a way. Good things for the BBC because he stood up to the government. I mean, there was a strong possibility that they'd be taken over. Churchill wanted that. The price was Churchill's future hostility to him. Churchill remembered that this tall, craggy man, Wuthering Heights as he called him later, had frustrated what he wanted to do at the time of the general strike. And that wasn't forgiven.
On May the 13th, 1926, the 2-week general strike ended.
Mr. Pugh informed the Prime Minister that the TUC had decided to terminate the general strike forthwith.
The broadcast was followed by Blake's Jerusalem, read by Reith himself.
And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on
I started this film believing that the Reith legend of independence from government had actually been exaggerated, and that actually much more important was what happened in the 50s and 60s. I think as I've gone on, I think the battle that Reith fought to stop Churchill taking over the BBC during the general strike was a seminal moment. And therefore I think Reith was incredibly important in it.
And how independent do you think the BBC was, the BBC dispensed with your services?
Well, interestingly, when I left the BBC, someone who I quite respect said to me, your problem was that you believed that the BBC was truly independent, and it never has been. When they got rid of me, what they said was, you'll be a lame duck. And what that meant was, you'll be no use to us in trying to negotiate a new charter, because you've so upset the government. And I think, and that's the reason they got rid of me. We now know from the minutes of that meeting that they thought that Tessa Jowell, who was the Secretary of State, didn't like me. Well, so what? It's not the job of the Director General of the BBC to court popularity with the government of the day.
Almost immediately, Reith's power was diluted. In 1927, the BBC became a public corporation, with a board of governors and a chairman.
He seems to have enjoyed his period when it was a company.
Yes.
More than when it was a corporation.
Oh, yes.
Explain.
Well, I think very simply because they said very early on in company days, we're leaving it to you, Reith, you'll come and report to the board once a month or whatever it was. Once it became a public corporation, he had those terrible things called governors, and he didn't like the governors. They were a nuisance. I always do best, he said, when I'm in sole command.
Working for the BBC.
At home, Reith became discontented. He was, he wrote, not being fully stretched. As early as 1928, there'd been rumours that he wanted to leave the BBC. And then there were concerns about his mental stability. He took to keeping a list of people he hated most.
It varied in length, and the cast changed from time to time. Churchill was on it for quite a bit, so was Mountbatten. And Charlie was on it at one time too.
Lasky wrote that thing about him, saying basically that he thought he was mad.
I think for some of his life he was mad. After the First War, he went to a psychological clinic in Glasgow for a time. And then, of course, late in life, he had what he called the electricity thing. He did go a few times for treatment.
Hello, Radio Olympia. This is direct television from the studios at Alexander Palace.
In the 1930s, another demon came to haunt Reith: television. Reith saw the future and hated it.
He didn't like television because he thought it would really be very difficult to provide television of the highest standards. He thought it would really corrupt and ruin the nation. And you can't go much further than that.
Do you think he was right?
No.
He thought it was something that he wouldn't be able to control in the way that he had been able to control radio, wireless. So he was in a very unsettled sort of state. Towards the end of his time, he was clearing his desk in about an hour and a half, leaving the rest of the day for him to go and poke his nose into the business of other people, which wasn't very sensible. And then he began to hear stories that he was being talked about as a chairman for Imperial Airways. What we don't know is whether there was any sort of approach made to the government by the governors to say, look, we quite think we'd like to have somebody different here now. Could you possibly find something big for this chap to do? And he was eventually, of course, summoned to meet the Prime Minister.
Reith, now 49, had held the top job in the BBC for 16 years. The Prime Minister was Neville Chamberlain.
And on the way, Reith said, I'm going to see the PM. It looks like the sack.
But that's not what happened.
The PM said he'd like him to be chairman of Imperial Airways. And Reith said, are you instructing me to do that? And Chamberlain said, well, I wouldn't put it quite like that, but...
Reith's diaries tell us that he agonised before deciding to go. He wept as he left Broadcasting House. He signed himself out as J.C.W. Reith, late BBC. Leaving the BBC can be an emotional experience.
This has been one of the most turbulent days in the BBC's history.
But the question that still puzzles me is, why did Reith resign? Why did he give up this job that he was obsessive about in the organisation that he'd created? Was he sacked, or did he fall on his sword? Reith's version is this.
I left the BBC and regretted it profoundly. I left the BBC because I thought it was fully well organised, capable of taking care of any development that came, war or anything. In other words, I wasn't busy enough.
His chant was, "The greatest mistake I ever made was to leave the BBC." And I think that is possibly a cover-up.
Do you think he was pushed?
Yes. I do, actually.
I think he felt he'd had enough of it. He wasn't being stretched enough. He could really have been stretched a great deal more if he had spent more time thinking about the future of television or the problems of how you would communicate information in time of war, a subject which came to interest him very quickly after he left the BBC.
Was he pushed or did he jump? Well, he'd been talking about jumping for years. I mean, it's preposterous to read, even in the very early days of the BBC, how frequently he said, "I'm off. That's it. I must go and do something different."
Whatever the answer, John Reith, at the age of 49, walked out of Broadcasting House and the BBC for the last time. He began, as he later described it, a long, silent shriek of despair. And he lived for another 32 years.
For the rest of his life, Reath sought the next Everest, the next challenge to fully stretch him. He never found it.
He wanted to be Prime Minister. He wanted to be Viceroy of India. He thought he might like to be Governor-General of South Africa.
Or to be ambassador to the United States. And it's perfectly clear that none of those things were within his grasp. And the fact that he couldn't get hold of them frustrated him.
It always had to be something bigger. It was always there, and it didn't happen.
He had a very curious sense of failure because even after he left the BBC, in conventional terms, his life couldn't be just described as a failure.
The list of appointments is impressive. He successfully chaired Imperial Airways and the Colonial Development Corporation. And at the outbreak of World War II, he was asked to stand as a Member of Parliament. Politically, Reith is difficult to pigeonhole. He often said he was a Liberal. But in the 30s, he openly admired at least the organisational abilities of the fascist leaders, Hitler and Mussolini.
He took his mother to tea on the terrace at the House of Commons. Lady Astor came up to them and said to Mrs. Reith, "Is it from you that he gets his Mussolini trays?"
So he wasn't a Democrat, really?
No. He would say, "I approve of democratic aims, but I don't think one can necessarily achieve them by democratic purposes."
So he believed in the public interest?
Yes.
But he believed the best way of achieving the public
Yes.
interest
Yes.
was for him to make the decision?
So long as he was defining the public interest, yes.
He wanted to win the war, but Churchill was doing it. It was intolerable. And so the gloom at times during the war in this household was visible.
In 1940, Prime Minister Chamberlain engineered a parliamentary seat for Reith at Southampton. In the crowd there, to congratulate him, someone he knew well.
He was standing in a hotel lounge, and there were a group of officers, army officers, who were going off abroad, going off to France. And one of them came up to him and said, "Good luck, John." It was Johnny.
It was the last time he and Charlie Bowser would ever meet. But Reith would never forget him.
Wherever Reith went, he tried to get Charlie in as his number two. Even when he had gone to the BBC, somewhere in the diaries he says, "The fool, he could have been my number two here today." And after one of the immediate post-war jobs he did, he wrote to somebody and suggested that Charlie should get the MBE. Charlie got an MBE.
So from today's perspective, you'd look at this and you'd say, here was a man having a relationship with another man and was getting him a job everywhere he went. One wouldn't survive today doing that, would you?
No.
As Hitler swept through Europe, Reith was appointed Minister of Information, then Minister of Transport. He became Lord Reith of Stonehaven, and in the House of Lords, Minister of Works. It was a huge job, for he was now responsible for rebuilding Britain's blitz cities. But he wasn't in the cabinet. He wanted a job that would bring him into the heart of things, in daily contact with Prime Minister Churchill. He was, he told his diary, lonely, jealous, unhappy. Then, out of the blue, Churchill sacked him.
He couldn't believe it. He was shattered. Couldn't believe this. And sank into a deep trough of depression.
Churchill, in Reith's view, was a hedonist. He enjoyed himself. And that was not a good thing. You had to toil terribly in Reith's language.
Temperamentally, they were very different. They both thought that they were men of fate, destiny. Churchill, of course, was on a totally different plane in relation to what he actually achieved during the war.
Reith wrote bitterly to Churchill. "I am," he said, "someone whom you broke and whose life you ruined." Even 20 years later, it still hurt him.
I regretted very much indeed, Mr. Freeman, that Mr. Churchill didn't give me 10 times as much work and responsibility as he did. I believe I could have carried it, and I could have helped him enormously.
He writes in his diaries quite regularly about feeling suicidal. Was that real or was that an act?
Real.
Yet by 1943, Reith had recovered sufficiently to find a different way to help the war effort. He went back into uniform as a lieutenant commander and, using his remarkable organisational skills, he coordinated the shipping and material for the D-Day invasion of Europe. Yet in the months before the invasion, he could still write, "I really feel I should contemplate killing myself. I don't know how to do it decently. I'm absolutely at the end of my tether, and I'm making it terrible for Muriel." After the war, Reith held a number of directorships. Increasingly, he lived in London. Marista remembers he rented an apartment in Lambeth Palace, while his wife Muriel and family lived in Scotland. Their lives became increasingly separate. Now, as Reith saw it, he also lost his daughter. Marista married a Scottish minister, Murray Leishman, whom she'd met at university. And Leishman found himself added to Reith's list of most hated people.
He explained a little bit about his hate list. Mentioned the 3 famous names, Churchill and Montgomery. Mountbatten. And he had a thing about Anthony Eden. He didn't like him. And he said, "I add from time to time and put one up and one down, but by and large there are 7 or 8 names." And it was quite clear that he was, considering where I would come.
Whoever was going to marry you was going to upset your father?
Absolutely.
Why?
Only the 4th person of the Trinity would do for Reith's daughter, in his view.
It said, "I suppose as far as I'm concerned is saying to hell with you." So that was the beginning of an amazing acquaintanceship. I discovered afterwards he was absolutely terrified. He had written a 6-page document carefully typed out by his secretary. Every word that I said and him in reply is like some of the Ibsen characters, terribly tough and big and jagged on the outside, but inside terribly weak and in conflict.
In the 1960s, Reith was chairman of British Oxygen. He was given a Rolls Royce and a driver. Barbara Hickman applied for a job as his secretary and was surprised to be questioned deeply about her religion.
He went on to talk about hymns, which he was keen on, especially the metrical psalms, coming from, again, his Presbyterian background. And so he then started to ask if I knew, "Behold the mountain of the Lord, in latter days shall rise." And fortunately, I knew that, and I had been brought up to know the names of hymn tunes, so I could say it was sung to the tune Glasgow. And I think it was on the merits of that I really got the job.
How demanding was he as a boss?
Well, he always maintained that a secretary's life was not her own. That was one of his favourite dictums, and he therefore felt you had to be on call 24 hours a day.
That included Christmas Day, when Reith refused to join his family at the farm in Scotland and stayed alone in London.
He was on the phone all Christmas afternoon, just needing somebody to talk to. He was pretty depressed and having death wishes, but he was his own worst enemy.
So why did he choose to be alone at Christmas?
I think he felt uncomfortable at the farm. I think mainly, though, he was free to ring the person who meant so much to him at that time, Dawn Mackay, and the Mackay family.
For 5 years, the name of Dawn Mackay dominates Reith's daily diary. Like a lovesick lad, Reith indicated he felt his life had taken on a new and giddy meaning.
Dawn Mackay had just left school, Heathfield, as it then was. She became a dancing teacher at Madame Vacani's, a fashionable dancing school of the day where the royal princes were taught to dance. And he became quite besotted, lavished presents on her, expensive presents, jewellery and so on. Took her about, took her to the BBC, introduced her as his goddaughter at the BBC initially, wanted her to become the guardian of his diaries, which she'd no room for in her little flat. Reath took her to Ascot. Leonard Miles was astonished, A, to see Reith drinking champagne, and B, to see Reith trotting down to the Tote to place a bet. Here, the man who'd railed so against the BBC broadcasting racing results. He became quite obsessed by her.
She was a girl of 20 and he was in his 60s, 70s at the time.
How much did he hurt his wife?
Hugely. That's the saddest thing.
Wouldn't you say?
Yes. Yes. It was a major anxiety, hurt, distress. I mean, any of those words would have fitted.
Curiously, we found Dawn Mackay, now widowed, living not 60 miles from Marista's home in Scotland.
What do you think he was seeking in his friendship with you?
I've no idea. I think he was fascinated by us as a family because we were probably very different. We were fairly happy-go-lucky. We had a great deal of fun together.
Do you think he coveted that?
Yes, I think so in some ways. And yet he'd have hated it. Because occasionally he'd get very cross if somebody else arrived for tea when he wanted the whole family to devote their attention to him.
And were you flattered by the attention of this great man?
No, I was slightly fascinated by him because, I mean, he was such a towering figure. And he, I think, taught me a great deal. I remember one day asking him something of what was the Monopolies Commission, and I got 20 pages next day.
Were you aware of the diaries he kept?
Well, he was always talking about his diaries and what he was going to do with them when he died. I didn't realise, I don't think, he kept such detailed diaries.
What did you feel when you discovered that he had kept such detailed diaries, including his hopes for you?
I didn't know he had. I really didn't know he had. With the wisdom of hindsight and what I know now, I think he was a total fantasist.
Do you think he fantasised about his hopes for Marista?
I think she was the one person that he really, really loved in his own way. But you can't love somebody if you don't let them be themselves.
And what about his wife, Muriel?
He hardly ever mentioned her. It was almost as if she didn't exist in a way.
As Reith's secretary, it was Barbara Hickman's job to type Reith's diary every morning. Reith was desperate for what he saw as his relationship with Dawn to continue, and he persuaded Barbara to act as a go-between, carrying letters to Dawn and to her mother.
I was caught up in something which troubled me morally. I didn't like the relationship with Dawn, not that I had anything against Dawn herself, but because it created difficulties with Lady Reath, and I wasn't prepared to be party to any of the kind of white lies that I might be asked to tell Lady Reath as to what he was going to be doing that evening. I just refused. That was where I did draw the line.
Was he in love with Dawn, do you think?
He was absolutely infatuated by her. She took over his life completely. I mean, I don't think of her wish, but it was just the fact that he needed to have somebody to devote his complete attention to, and Dawn happened to be that person.
Do you think it was a sexual relationship?
No, I don't. His diaries told all, because it was his lifeblood, really, to be able to discharge all this stuff he had going on inside him And I know that he was sometimes sexually aroused, but I'm absolutely sure that it was a platonic relationship. It was a very personal account of a man's troubled, emotional life and his inability to find satisfaction in any other way other than through this particular relationship.
Yours was a close relationship. Was it a sexual relationship in any way?
Most certainly not. I think I would have found that grotesque.
You were an important part of his life.
I never thought so at the time. I didn't see it that way. But I suppose with wisdom of hindsight, everybody tells me that. But I certainly didn't see it that way, believe it or not.
How did you see it then?
He was just like a sort of another uncle around. And we always called him Lord John, and never, ever called him by his Christian name.
Dawn, in her 20s, was immersed in her own social life with friends of her own age. Reath became increasingly desperate.
He was actually suicidal. And one night she'd been out at a ball, and he rang her in the small hours of the morning. And he said, "I'm sitting here with my service revolver on my lap." Now, she had been trained as a counsellor, and she spent about 2 hours talking him out of doing what he said he was going to do.
Next morning, a distressed Dawn rang her father. Angry and concerned, he telephoned Reith. That day, the revolver was handed in to the police. In 1964, Dawn married a Queen's messenger, Charles Hargreaves. She and Reith hardly spoke again. Can you explain, because of your background as a Samaritan, these great mood swings that he had?
I don't think he was ever really at peace. I think he could be happy, and he could have happy times. But within himself, I don't think he was ever happy.
When you look back at this period of your life, are there any regrets?
One huge regret is that it caused distress to both Lady Reath and the Barrister, which I suppose I must have been very naive or very stupid, and that is my biggest regret.
It's a long time ago now, and I must say I was hesitant in coming back on all this, except it's a story that's never been told, really. I keep wondering what this person over there would think about my talking with you, because one of the things he expected, and which I've now not fulfilled, is complete loyalty and complete confidence. But I think I wanted to see the record more complete. And also, I suppose, if one's being honest, it gives one the opportunity to say, yes, and I was part of it too.
With Dawn married, Reith had more time to pursue his other obsession, the inner workings of the BBC. He'd always openly assessed the Director-Generals who succeeded him, starting with Robert Foote in 1942.
Foote told me that on the first day that he went to work in the BBC as Director-General, nobody in the BBC bothered about him at all. He had some sharpened pencils on his desk, but no paper to use. Nobody came in to talk to him. And then in the middle of the morning, the phone rang, and a voice said, "This is Reith speaking. You really are not up to the job, and you should go at once." Now, that's a very remarkable story.
Reith didn't like Carlton Green.
Oh, no. Hated him. Hated him. Divorced. Wouldn't do. He didn't get on too well with Ian Jacob, but in every case he was jealous of them and thought he could be back doing the job better than they were doing it. And there was a rumour in the press that Jake was leaving the BBC to become Director-General of NATO. Reith wrote to him and said, "If this is true, may I succeed you as Director-General?"
In 1967, John Reith looked back on his life in a wide-ranging interview with Malcolm Muggeridge.
My life has been about one half as successful as I think it might have been.
But now the next question is, what would have been, in your eyes, success?
If I had been fully stretched, or nearly fully stretched, for a far, far longer number of years. I know perfectly well that I'm not a complete failure, but I don't think I get a pass, 50% or whatever. I don't think I get a pass, in my estimate of what I might have done.
In his 70s, Reath went back to the Glasgow Academy to give out the end-of-year prizes. He delivered a message to the pupils based on what he had learned, he implied, from Dawn Mackay. It was life's for living. I had never been told about it when young, and I haven't learnt it fully yet. But at least I now realise how much I've missed and how many mistakes I've made.
John Reith died in hospital in Edinburgh after a fall. In her book, his daughter Marista wrote, "On June the 16th, 1971, we bade him farewell." And that was it.
What did you feel when he died?
Relief. Is that an odd thing to say?
Did you like him?
I think of Lear, a king and a kingmaker of a kind. And it was said of him, "Oh, let him pass. He loves him not, who would upon the rack of this cruel world stretch him out further." And I think of that too because his aim was to be stretched. And I suppose that's why he wanted to come back here, because this was a place of wonderful holidays as a young man. And he climbed the hills and saw the great views of the Cairngorms and felt, as he said there, the stirrings to achieve.
So at the end of this journey, do you understand Reithian better?
I don't think I understand Reithian better, because I think I always understood what Reithian meant and how it had been misused. But I understand Reith better. You could have written a Shakespearean play, a tragedy about Reith. He's obviously a deeply religious man, which I'm not, and therefore understanding this battle that goes on in his life, I have some difficulty, this battle about good and evil. But it was clearly there all the time. It was there from the very beginning in terms of his relationship with Charlie. It was there with a number of women he met. Somehow he could never have been either happy or, in his terms, successful. I think what he achieved was remarkable. I think the BBC is one of the great British institutions, and I suspect wouldn't have happened without Reith. When I started this, I thought that in some ways we would debunk the myth of Reith, the man fighting for political independence for the BBC. And actually I think we've done the opposite.
More sympathetic to him now than you were when you set out on this journey?
Well, there's two sides to Reith. There's Reith as the man who created the BBC, and I respect him enormously. And there's Reith the man, who is a deeply, deeply flawed character. And yet, I quite like him.
Yea, though I walk in death's dark vale.
Next tonight, another personality whose name is just about synonymous with the BBC, Sir Patrick Moore, with a special 50th anniversary Sky at Night.